Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to Chattering with Nicholas Vince. In a couple of moments, I'm going to be talking with Eric Red, but before I do that, there's a couple of things I just wanted to say. I just want to remind people about last week's guests, Stuart and Paul, who were talking about Book of Monsters. They're doing very well on their Kickstarter campaign for Book of Monsters. They've reached £15,000, which is 33% of their target, and they've got a couple of days to go. So if you haven't done so already, please check out that, because it's a very unusual project in that you get to choose the plot of the movie. So yeah, just to do that. And then another couple of completely surprising things, and that was the fact that my first short film, The Night Whispered, I've been asked if we can do a couple of screenings, which I was completely unexpected. Firstly, that's on next Wednesday, the 26th of July at Stanley's Film Club. It's going to screen just before the feature film Get Out, which was released earlier this year. So I'm very excited about that, as it's the local film club to where we filmed it. So I'm expecting that a lot of people will actually know the locations that we used. The second one is going to be on the 16th of August at Nova Nights at the Horse Hospital, London. I'll give you more details of that closer to the time. But again, that's going to be, we're going to screen The Night Whispered, then I'm going to be interviewed by Billy Chainsaw, and then we're going to screen Hellbent, the first gay slasher movie. So that should be a fun evening. And of course, you know, that's it. So the other thing, of course, I have to say is that basically in 2 weeks' time will be the 100th episode of Chattering with Nicholas Vince. So next week's going to be the... Thank you, Eric. Eric's applauding the way in the background. So I'm going to dedicate that to a gentleman who we lost recently, and that's George Romero. So I will give you, again, I'll give you more information about that. But before we do all that, yeah, that will come at the end of the show. But Eric, please... welcome. Thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you for having me on.
So let's kind of dive right in. We've got some questions that have been submitted by our audience. First question I thought was a really interesting one. What is your earliest memory?
Well, I have a very visual memory by nature. And the first memory I have was back when I was 6 months old.
6 months old?
Yeah, when my mother and father moved to a Pennsylvania suburb called Havertown, before we moved to Philadelphia. And I can remember a number of things. I can remember the U-Haul we drove in. I can remember a carnival, but mostly I remember what the place looked like at 6 months. I mean, I remembered every single room. And the reason I realized later was that I formed pictures from the childhood books. You know, when they read me The Three Bears, when they read me other, particularly that one, because I like that one. The only picture I had was where I lived. So all of the pictures I have from when I remember the childhood story, The Three Bears, were this place. And in some cases, it's fairly detailed. So you can actually use that kind of detective work. I bet a lot of people can do that if they think about it.
This thing that's really, I mean, I know a friend of mine who, and I've no reason to disbelieve him, but he reckons he remembers being born from that onwards, and he's a very talented artist, and I find that extraordinary. My earliest is 3 years. I can't remember anything, but that was when my father, with my youngest brother was being born. And my father decided to get something from the car, took the middle brother with him, but left me in the waiting room. I just remember my father walking off and leaving me. And everybody, you know, these ladies asking why I was there at 3.5 years old. It's
well,
like
you know how you get a memory, you're walking down the street and you get a memory from when you were 2 years old. I mean, I think that every single thing you experience, witness, see, is in the computer. You know, it's in the computer in here, and it just depends on accessing it. So some people can maybe access it more than others, but you know, I think all of your experiences are like a long film loop.
Do you think that is also one of the reasons why you're so creative? Do you find that visual stuff feeds into your creativity in films and etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tend to think visually, and of course, movies are a visual medium, and it's telling stories with pictures, and it's both an instinct and a training.
Yeah.
But when I started writing novels, I think I'm definitely inclined to. I try to paint a picture.
Right.
I mean, I try to create as when you're making a film, you're trying to make the world as realistic and detailed as possible, so the audience believes it and they kind of vicariously enter it. And I sort of bring that approach to novels too. To try to write it as immersively and evoke the world to myself and to the reader as much as possible. And a lot of that's visual for sure.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something we'll chat about later on when we talk about the books. So, speaking of films, which film have you watched most often, do you think?
It probably has to be The Exorcist. The reason being, I was maybe 11 or 12 when it came out, and I saw it, and it imprinted me. Not as the subject matter, of course, I thought was and do think it's still maybe the greatest horror story that's been written, but it was the way it was filmed. I think I loved movies, but that was the first time when I went to a movie I actually began technically noticing things like cinematography and editing and sound design. And there was something about the realistic way the film was put together and the way that I believed what was going on that really interested me in kind of learning more about how films were made. I actually, quite illegally, I took a tape recorder into the theater when I was about 12, and I recorded the whole movie. And then I listened for many times. I listened to just the soundtrack of the picture, and listened to the sound effects and the sound transitions and the music, and all of that just really interested me. So that was a formative film for me, and I've probably seen it 100 times. It's not a film I watch now because I like other types of films now, but I still think it's definitely one of the best films I've ever seen, and it was a movie I watched over my lifetime simply because it was one of the films that made me want to make movies.
Wow. Of course, what I find, so you got to see The Exorcist at 11 years old. Now, in my country, this just wouldn't have been, when that came out, that wouldn't have happened. You had to be at least 18, possibly 21 to see an X-rated movie. So did you go with your folks or with friends or?
I grew up in New York City during the 1970s, man. And I was big for my age. No, New York City in the 70s was a very different world than we live in right now. It was a melting pot. It was very liberal, sexually, expressively, everything else. And, one of my other earliest visual memories is in 1968 going to first grade, and there was a peace march in Washington Square, and a girl lifted her shirt, and I got to see my first pair of adult breasts. So that was a visual memory that stayed.
I can imagine that. Had you read the Blatty book of The Exorcist before you see, or did you go on to read the book?
I had read the book that summer, and it made a huge impact. I really made it, and I couldn't wait to see the movie. And it's to date, there's only 3 or 4 films that have ever scared me to the degree where it's like jump out of your seat, foot in the life socket. And there's only one movie I've ever seen I couldn't sit through. And I saw The Exorcist on its opening day. And actually, I think I saw it the first time in New York City. And I think it was the first show on a weekday, and I was the only person in the audience. And I made it about as far as the girl puking, and I left. Right. And then I went back the next day to be sure to catch it. It didn't, but it actually won the fight. It was the scariest, most realistic thing I'd ever seen. I mean, it's funny, I mean, you have the films that are, or the cultural things, the books, the films, the music that's formative to you, and you assume it's classic, and that the next generation and the one after that's going to feel the same way. And I don't know whether the current generation would regard that movie now with the same way that we did then. Probably not. So but at the time, and I thought its sense of authenticity, which I still think in the performances, the characters, I mean, the complete 100% credible handling of the whole, bigger than life kind of story, was to me, that felt like the right way to do it. And so I brought that approach. It's actually, when I did my film 100 Feet, my ghost story with Famke Janssen a few years ago, you can still see the Exorcist all over it. They were conscious. Well, we consciously tried to evoke that kind of mood, and Rosemary's Baby, and Wait Until Dark, and those New York kind of set films.
Right. Now that's interesting. You mentioned that I'm trying to think. When I got to see The Exorcist, I was in my early 20s, and all I can really remember, the bit that really worried me, was when there's a chest of drawers that starts kind of walking across a room towards the bed. I don't know what. I think I'd probably seen, by the time I got to see it, because we'd heard so much about it, I didn't get to see it very early on. I'm probably, I was in my mid-20s by the time I got to see it. It's interesting. So what scares you? You said, okay, that scared you. That's one experience when you're in a cinema. But is there anything that particularly scares you?
Not much. I mean, I think you get to, at a certain age, I mean, if you're talking about what really scares you, not something, like cockroaches or, snakes or those obvious phobias. But in terms of, nothing much scares me really at my age. And I think at a certain age, you've been through so much that, even death, you begin to take, a little more analytically.
Right.
But I suppose if there's one thing I'm afraid of, it's not making the most of each day. It's not doing all I can do work-wise, doing all I can do for my family, for my wife, my dogs, my friends. I think as you get older, you feel the time more. You feel how that you can't waste time as much, but that kind of fear is actually a good motivator. It motivates you that you don't want to waste it. You don't want to not get everything done that you want to do. So I suppose if I have a fear, maybe that's a thing that
the clock ticking.
Kind of use.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Yeah, I know how you feel. It's kind of like, there's just so much to get done, and needs to be done. I always find it's very easy to get overwhelmed by all. Do you? Just like, it's an on-topic question. Then it's like, how do you organize your day in that case? If you're talking about not getting as much done as you hope to get done each day, do you organize your day around writing, or?
Yes, I do these days. I mean, I have I'm a novelist. I'm a novelist these days. So, and I have a very, very strict schedule that I keep of 2,000 words a day, 6 days a week. Right. That's how you get it done. I mean, if you really want to put books out. But one thing I started doing a few years ago is I get up at 5 in the morning and I hit the gym for an hour and lift weights and treadmill. And I found that exercise in the morning just kind of changes everything. It gets your mind straight. It gives you energy. It gets rid of just a lot of. For me, I find it's energy, and it increases my energy and enjoyment and positive spirit for the day. I don't want to sound like an infomercial here, but actually, when I was younger, when I was directing films like Body Parts and Cohen and Tate, I used to do gymnastics and would train heavily for like 2 months before starting a film. And so that's kind of been. My father was a champion athlete, and so it kind of runs in the family. Right. And I find that is. Has an enormous effect on the quality of my work, how my brain works, and just my overall well-being. So, I mean, I recommend it for all writers.
Just, and you train every day or 3 days a week or
6 days a week, and then I take a day off. There's one day off I take off and hang with the wife and dogs and watch movies and do nothing and have no plan, because you have to give your brain a rest.
Right. Okay, that sounds like a very sensible. I mean, that's one of the reasons we have the dog, is to get me out the house. Otherwise, it's too easy just to actually just find yourself in front of the computer, in my case, and just doing social media stuff or so on. So yeah, getting out the house and doing those. Yes. Good. Okay, so you're talking about making movies earlier on. So what was your first produced film script?
My first produced film script was my second script. It was The Hitcher, and I wrote it in 1983. I'd left New York. I'd made a short film and tried to break into the film industry that way. And although I got I actually got national distribution on television on it through the competitor at the time for MTV, a show called Night Flight. But I went broke. I put all my money into it, like old young and like you do at that age. Yeah. And so I drove a New York cab for a year, a checker cab, and kind of got tired of New York. Although saw a very interesting side of New York driving a cab in the 70s. I mean, it was an experience I would not trade. So I left. I just took off. I had friends in Austin, Texas. I'd never been there, and I just did an auto driveway, kind of like Jim Halsey does in the movie. He did exactly what I did, right. And drove to Texas. And kind of on the way to Texas, the idea for the movie formulated, and I had all this time on my hands. I'd never done a drive like that. And the minute I hit the wide open spaces of Texas and that the emptiness, it just imprinted me. So right. I pretty much had the story worked out by the time I got to Austin, and I wrote it in the first month. And I didn't have an agent. I didn't know anybody in Hollywood. So I knew that people didn't read unsolicited scripts. So I ordered a copy of the California production manual, and I went through it, and I looked up every producer whose name I recognized. And this is actually kind of a very typical Hollywood story. One of the people I sent The Hitcher to, I sent him a teaser letter first. I sent out teaser letters to everybody. And got like a 40% response of people who said, fine, you don't have to have an agent, you can send the script. But I sent I sent one of these letters to Phil Feldman, who produced The Wild Bunch. And I was like, this guy's going to love The Hitcher, right? Now, he was a producer at Fox. The letter was misdelivered. It was sent to the other Feldman over at Fox, a guy named Ed Feldman, a producer named Ed Feldman. And his development guy, David Bombeck, read my letter and said, normally we don't read unsolicited scripts, but you've piqued my interest with the letter, send the script. And then they bought it 6 months later. We did some development with it, and it got made. So that was, I sold it, I guess, in '84, and the film was released in '86. It was just a very, very different time in Hollywood. I mean, it was such a different landscape than it is now. I mean, we were very proud then. Ed had just produced Witness, and he would produce Near Dark actually after The Hitcher. And we really wanted to do something original. I mean, that was we held that at a premium. We like to work in genres, but the whole idea was not to do a reboot or a retread or franchise or whatever. So it was a very, very different environment. Then we were kind of all first timers in that movie. I was a first time writer. Bob Harmon, the director, was first time director. Ed Feldman's development man, David Bombeck, became a producer on that. And we just kind of went with our gut on it. And, we really didn't compromise. I mean, it was really just a great experience.
So how closely were you were you there on set when it was being filmed, or like you hand it over to the director and producer? And
oh no, I was very close. I was very close with the producers, and I was a very young, very outspoken pain in the ass. So yes, yeah, no, I was there, but we all got along great. I mean, it was not I mean, if a screenwriter in general, a screenwriter's got a couple of choices. I mean, if you're one of the kinds that writes original scripts, you can turn it over and walk away, and that's fine. You know, I mean, your responsibility is the script. I always wanted to be involved.
Right.
So in almost all cases, you know, I have been. And I'm glad I was. You know, I mean, not to say that you know, I mean, I really, none of the people we cast were people who I thought of. But it's good. You know, it was a writer should be involved, and it behooves the producers and directors to involve the writer if he's like the writer of an original screenplay, because something came out of him that was the quality you're trying to channel into a movie.
Right.
But generally, we got along, I think, pretty good.
It's a great movie. It's one of my favorite movies. And Howard is, I mean, it's just the relationship between the two leads. Howard is just terrifying. I met him once, and he was, in fact, I was so overawed I could hardly speak. Just amazing. It's a really, really wonderful film, The Hitcher. Okay, so you make movies and so on, but recently you've changed to writing novels, as you mentioned earlier on.
Mm-hmm.
So what was the first, and if you can remember this, what was the first book that made you cry?
Well, I mean, I think the first book that made me cry was a book I read or was read to me as a child. I'm almost certain, and I don't really remember.
Right.
My father read to me every night. He was a double PhD and a metallurgical engineer and a photographer, and really a remarkable man. And it was very, very important to him that I learned how to read and was literate. So, I mean, I could read when I was in kindergarten, and, you know, I mean, so he would read me every night. You know, he read me a lot of books like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, like one chapter a night. The Wind and the Willows, The Chronicles of Narnia. And I guess if I had to hazard a guess, because, you know, it's a tearjerker,
Yeah.
it would probably, the Chronicles of Narnia would have been the first book that I cried at. I can remember more of the books, you know, in adult life that have made me cry, which are kind of an eclectic bunch. But yes,
Really?
It still does happen. Mm-hmm.
Really? It's I thought it was a very interesting question, because I can't remember. I remember that sense of loss at the end of reading a very good book, that you've come to the end of this world and you're no longer part of this world. Films made me cry.
Yeah.
You know, and I may have mentioned this on the show before, that basically Fiddler on the Roof, the end of Fiddler on the Roof. In fact, I don't think I can actually watch that now.
Really?
Without, it's the song Anatevka at the end. I remember we saw it when it first came out. I was with my parents. I'd have been a teenage boy, and I just remember my mother leaning across and saying, "Nick, it's not real." And I'm thinking, it is real. I know this is based on history. And this is, you know, these wonderful, wonderful people. It's Fiddler on the Roof gets me every single time. I don't know why particularly, but yeah, Fiddler on the Roof for me. Oh, the sun's just decided to come streaming through the window.
The movies that make you cry, I think, are easier to remember.
Yeah.
The books are but I think that when a book does make you cry, it has affected you on a far more personal level, even though the effect is the same.
Yeah. No, I think because, you know, you internalize, I think, books, because there's so much imagination. It's not presented for you on the screen. You've got to actually build the pictures yourself. Talking earlier on about, you know, the images.
Well, actually, what you say there, that's to me the most exciting difference between writing a script or making a movie and writing a novel, because right. You know, when you make a movie, you know, you're giving people the pictures, and everybody kind of sees the same movie. They may like it, they may not like it, but it's the same experience, and you're giving the pictures. I mean, the exciting thing I find about writing novels is everybody who reads it brings their own pictures to the prose.
Right.
It's a kind of more intimate connection, and you know, that sort of proactive involvement that I think people put more of themselves into reading, and that's and more they invest more because they bring their own pictures, and that's a very exciting. you know, and that's why people have, I find that people have far more subjective and controversial reactions to books than they do to movies in general. There's people who, I mean, I certainly had in my few novels, you know, people who've hated them, people who've loved them, the same book. There's people who get it, people who don't, particularly if you're dealing with a subject matter like sex, where, you know, which my first book did. And, you know, everybody has very, very different, you know, subjective ideas about all that. But yeah, I find that readers are more subjective, have a more subjective response to books than film viewers do to films.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I suppose that's true. That's very interesting. I mean, as you say, it's easier possibly to remember a film that made you cry in emotion. But yeah, I think they tend to have, yeah, so much deeper. And I tend to reread the same books again and again.
Do you really? You read the same book?
Yeah, I will. Oddly enough, mostly because I read at night. I can't read horror. I can no longer read. There's no way I can read horror or anything really dark late in the evening, because I'll just dream. It'll affect me. Is what we were saying. You know, they have a profound. Unless I think the most dramatic effect that I ever had on that was Thomas Harris and Red Dragon.
Oh, one of my favorite books.
Yeah, and I just remember reading it, and when I got to where the villain was on the loose and was going to come and get somebody, and I was there falling asleep, and then something disturbed me in the flat at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I couldn't get back to sleep again because I was completely convinced the killer was at the door. So I had to get up, turn on all the lights in the flat, and then had to read the book until the very end. So that
it's a sensational novel.
Yeah, it's they all. I mean, I've read Red Dragon and so on. Yeah, again, just really gets under the skin. So I tend to read Terry Pratchett because they're really interesting novels, great characters, and I know what's going to happen, and then I can get to sleep after I've read for a bit, just to turn myself off for the rest of the day. So yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so we're talking about writing novels. What was your first published story?
My first published short story was a story called In the Mix, about a young rapper in East St. Louis who basically strong arms an old record producer to produce his record, because this record producer has this really, you know, fantastic sound, this rap sound, and it kind of holds the guy at gunpoint, and the guy does record the record with him, but he puts him in a torture device because that's how he gets his unique sound. And it turns out this old record producer was, you know, grew up with the R&B world in the 60s and 70s and hates rap, and it's his kind of revenge on the world. But I sold that one. That was maybe my third or fourth short story I wrote. I sold it to Dark Delicacies, an anthology and a book from a great LA bookstore called Dark Delicacies in LA that Del Howison and Sue Howison run. And they published an anthology, and my timing was good, and that was the first one that I had out. The first story I sold was actually before that. I wrote a Western horror tale called The Buzzard about a cowboy who's being pursued by kind of this relentless vulture that's trying to kill him.
Right. And
it was the first story I ever submitted to a magazine. It sold right away, and the magazine went out of business. This I would learn, by the way, as my journey into publishing began. You know, as anybody who gets into publishing, you know, the long road, this is like, it becomes, you know, pro forma. But they went out of business. But right after my story was published in Dark Delicacies, I actually sold The Buzzard to Weird Tales. And after that, I had them, you know, I've had stories published in, you know, Cemetery Dance and Dark Discoveries and a whole bunch of wonderful magazines. But, you know, I wanted to write novels. And since 2012, I've written one a year. And starting next year, I'll be writing 2 a year.
Oh, that's interesting. So you're really and similar, I presume, similar length novels, or is that just because you've become more confident about writing novels, or why 2 a year rather than 1 a year?
Well, you know, in building a readership, I mean, you want to get books out, and you know, it's a matter really of of maintaining a good kind of a good writing discipline. Particular because I'm starting to write series now. Like my new novel, The Wolves of El Diablo, is a sequel to a book I wrote a few years ago called The Guns of Santa Sangre, and both books are the first 2 books in the trilogy. And you know, when I wrote actually The Wolves of El Diablo, it's a werewolf western. I'm sure we'll talk about it later. It changed the entire way I started thinking about story. Maybe it goes back to like hearing Lord of the Rings read to me when I was a child and stuff like that. But once I took it was so exciting to take the characters from the first book and think about what would happen next with them and where their story would go from there. And actually the second and third book came out of it, and it got me very excited about the idea of mythologies, about multi-level narratives, character over a series of stories that are individual. I mean, each book is its own world, but that's kind of the way I think about I think about books. I usually I don't really think in terms of standalones. I think of longer narratives, and that's kind of become also, I think, the storytelling mode of our era. You know, people, the 2-hour format that you and I grew up with, you know, features is becoming a thing of the past. I mean, television series, as another example, readers, viewers like stories told in 20 hours, 40 hours, and you know, maybe they always have, but they're more fun to write because, you know, you can keep your characters going and the whole thing builds, and you know, the adventure becomes, you know, the epic, the saga becomes that much more involved, and I find it enthralling to do, at least right now.
Right. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, we'll come back to the 2 books in a couple of moments if we may. And you kind of touched on this earlier on, what's the difference for you between writing a film script and writing a novel? And I'm kind of thinking in terms of, it's a story, you're telling a story. Does a different switch go on? You know, do you approach it physically in terms of the way you make your notes, or how do you work with the 2 different formats?
Well, I mean, the biggest difference I think between writing a novel and a film script is, you know, an author has a lot more storytelling as weapons in his or her arsenal. You know, I mean, a screenplay, you're limited to action, description, and dialogue, basically. And you know, but when you're writing a novel, you have all of that, but you also have, you can get inside characters' heads, you can do different points of view with different, and much greater narrative length and detail, and that for me is so much more fun to write, because, you know, there's this sort of sense of a plane taking off when you're writing the book. You're not being constrained. That said, you know, screenplays, action is character, you know, and you know, when everything in the script has to be shown. You know, the characters are defined by what they do and what they say. The narrative has to move from, you know, propulsively from scene to scene, and those are actually kind of good things to bring to writing a book. You know, to be very focused, that those kind of dramatic things where your characters are what they do, you know, what they say. Is a good, those habits that you get from screenplays are good ones. And you know, in some ways, you know, most screenwriters are kind of story wonks and are very narrative conscious. And you know, novels, of course, that's a good tool to bring, but it's so much more fun writing a book because you can go into so much more depth. But you know, I still write screenplays. It's great fun. The screenplays that I like, with the Hitcher and Near Dark and Cohen and Tate and those, I mean, I wrote a very spare, very economical, very kind of a story, no subplot type of script. That was the kind of thing that interests me. These very linear. I liked, when I was writing scripts, to cut all the crap out and just kind of reduce the story to its basic moving parts. Because, you know, I always figured then that you have 2 hours. You know, so the more crap you take out and the more you focus your confrontation on a few characters, the more, because of that that limited amount of time you have, the more you heighten the audience's involvement. And I still, you know, I still believe that. The funny thing was, when I started writing books, I would write much more complicated narratives, and editors kept telling me, you know, can't you do something like Cohen and Tate, something that's really kind of pared down? And I would say, like, there's not enough in that for a book. But, you know, I gradually began to learn what they were talking, what they meant.
Right.
So, you know, the clean sense of confrontation and stuff. It's been a learning curve, a definite learning curve, writing novels.
Right. And do you, when we were chatting a week or so ago, you talked about the fact that you use playlists.
Yes.
Yes. You're another big fan of playlists. Do you, how do you approach getting the playlist together? What sort of playlist do you put together?
I have a playlist for every project that continues to evolve along usually there's a queue, and I listen to a lot of movie scores. I would say that 90% of what I listen to, 70%, 75% of what I listen to are movie scores, and usually symphonic ones. You know, I love the classical composers like Jerry Goldsmith and Elmer Bernstein and John Williams, and maybe it's from making movies, but I find that listening to the scores to certain films, instantly, the minute I put it on, puts me right in the mood, brings up all of the atmosphere, brings up the story, the characters. It fires those, you know, those storytelling jets. So I'm not surprised. I'm sure many writers use playlists, but I usually start with like 1 or 2 cues that are kind of a key for me.
Right.
And, you know, I mean, some of it's obvious, like when I was writing the Guns of Santa Sangre and the Wolves of El Diablo, which are Westerns that happen to have horror elements in them. You know, I listened to a lot of my favorite Western scores that would just, and, you know, it just plays over and over. I'm not even sure I hear it while I'm writing it, you know, but like, you know, Jerry Goldsmith's score to Rio Conchos or The Hour of the Gun. There's a, you know, score to Tombstone. I mean, those instantly put you in the Western, you know, the Western action mode. You know, I have a private eye book I'm working on right now, and I listen to 3 Days of the Condor and other and you know, Michael Small scores from like Clute and things like that. They're often very, very different, but they each, you know, and you know, you might listen to it, have a playlist. It's all just rock songs. I know a bunch of people do that. To me, I don't know whether every writer listens to a playlist that directly pertains to their material, but with me, it specifically does. It's as if I was scoring the film.
That's interesting. Yeah, one of the other authors I spoke to, a guy called James Moran, who mentioned the importance of playlist to him. And I think, as you say, it kind of, if you've got Clute or 3 Days of the Condor going, then yeah, you're in that private, you know, that detective mode. Interesting, very interesting. Okay, so moving on to werewolves and so on. Actually, there's one question that keeps on coming up in my mind while we were talking. Westerns. You're writing in the books we're about to talk about, Westerns. The childhood books that you mentioned, and Narnia, a lot of British books. When did you become interested in Westerns and write in, and presumably the pulp fiction style Westerns, or was it just the films? What was your introduction to Westerns?
Well, you know, in the mythology of the Old West, I mean, in our perception of it, books and movies kind of cross-pollinate each other in terms of the mythology. I mean, it's inescapable. I mean, the real West, the true West, was a brutal, nasty, violent place full of a lot of drunken SOBs who were, you know, it wasn't a nice, it was a very dirty place, although there was a lot of heroism and all the rest of that. But, you know, it's become, the Western genre, the film genre is my favorite genre. over horror by far.
Right.
I mean, because I think it is the single most timeless and universal iconography for good versus evil stories. You know, there's something about the economy of elements with big, strong men and horses and shootouts and landscape, and the way the landscape often kind of reflects the character of the people. I mean, Westerns are very iconic: good guy, bad guy, black hat, white hat, or variations of gray hat stories. And the really good ones have a wonderful sense of confrontation. And I think it's I guess because I like mythologies, it's a timeless mythology, and it's a uniquely American mythology. I mean, at least it's my editor has said that that Westerns are the American Arthurian legend. And I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. I mean, The Once and Future King is one of my all-time favorite books. But that is maybe the way that King Arthur is for the English, or for people in the UK. Westerns are for us. I mean, it's our kind of thing, but I think it carries. And I mean, growing up, I just loved Western movies, you know, True Grit, The Searchers, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. In the 90s, I actually got a chance to make one, which is very, very tough in Hollywood. They've always been a very hard genre of film to get made for a number of reasons, even though the world loves them, and they do well if they're done right. But in the mid-90s, after Unforgiven came out, I was able to get a Western script of mine called The Last Outlaw filmed, and we did it for HBO. And I actually got a chance to go out and film it, and see what it was to film a Western, and filming outdoors and filming with horses and stunt riders, and it's you know why they did them. They're a really fun genre to film. Right. But I think that, so I've always loved the Western genre, and I love the horror genre. And the other thing I think Westerns allow is they allow for mashups, because they're such iconic good guy, bad guy stories. Westerns are often subsumed into cop films, or Dirty Harry is a Western, I mean, so a lot of times people disguise Westerns, but I thought that the idea for the Guns of Santa Sangre, which was a werewolf Western, came because I thought that Westerns and horrors, being both these iconic white hat, black hat stories, fit. Because, I mean, Westerns are all about gunfighters and shootouts, and werewolves have to be shot by silver bullets. So it seemed to mix. And what I thought would be fun with it was not just doing a nasty, scary, gory horror novel, but doing a book that had the kind of excitement and physical action and heroism that Westerns have. The emotional appeal of a Western with exceptionally bad guys. And the great fun about werewolves, I mean, the reason why they're maybe my favorite character is they're the only character in horror where you actually get to have two characters, because you get the day where you get the man who's struggling with lycanthropy for one, in one way or another, and then you get the creature he becomes. And I think that, I mean, I went back to the really brutal, horrific, old school werewolf that will tear you limb from limb as a force of pure bloodthirsty savagery. I wanted to bring it back to that in the Guns of Santa Sangre. I mean, I think they've kind of neutered this with these Twilight films and these fuzzy werewolves and all that nonsense. I mean,
cute werewolves, yeah.
Cute werewolves. I mean, to me, what a werewolf represents, I mean, I don't know whether, I always try to kind of explore when I'm writing something in the horror genre, what's the root of this myth? Why does this myth resonate with people? And I think that maybe werewolves are a metaphor for schizophrenia, but I think that what is horrific about the werewolf is that it is it's utterly lacking in humanity. It's completely savage. And the idea that you as a person with human connections, people you love, could lose control and become or helpless to avoid it, to once a month, twice, 2-3 times a month, turn into this monster without any humanity. And I think that that's kind of the horror and the tragedy of the werewolf, is that the person who turns into him may be a good person, but sooner or later he's doomed to kill everybody he loves. And that is great, That's the old, the Lawrence Talbot model. When I did Bad Moon, which is my first werewolf project, basically Uncle Ted, the Michael Pare character in that, is along those lines. He's somebody who hates what he's become, and he's trying to cure himself and trying to do it with family love, but bit by bit, he's becoming more, the werewolf is taking over his day personality. But the werewolves in the Guns of Santa Sangre and the Wolves of El Diablo, these Mexican bandits, love being werewolves. They love it. They love being the baddest asses around. They love being able, even as human beings, they're kind of like the vampires in Near Dark. I mean, who actually love being vampires. These bandits, even though they have their tragic side, they love it. And so but you do get, the fun of it is you do get these two characters. You get characters that can talk and deal with your heroes, but then you get these monsters. And in the first book, it was really about three kind of fallen American gunfighters who are anti-heroes at best, who take this mission and get their humanity reaffirmed and reinforced by battling something that is the total absence of humanity, which are these werewolves. And that's what the story was about. And they end up, at the end, regaining their honor and not getting paid for their mission. But that was sort of the things I had running around my head when I wrote the first book.
I should actually, I was just pouring myself a glass of water, and what I want to do is actually, I'll take this opportunity just to share these beautiful books that Paul Fry sent me from SST Publications. I showed them last week, and now we've got so much sun coming through, but hopefully you can see that. That's the cover of the Wolves of, the Guns of Santa Sangre, and I have to say, I love the waxy feel to the cover of these books. And then we have the cover of, I'm trying not to get the Wolves of El Diablo. It's interesting, reading these. We talk about filming, and I think the Jack Ketchum quote that I put up about this one particularly, you can see it being filmed. Yeah, we're talking about images earlier on, the descriptions, but also the plotting and the speed of it. Is very much in my mind. It really did run as a film. So you've done these. The second book, The Wolves of El Diablo, is coming out next month in August. Is that right?
It's coming out in August. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And that's from SST Publications.
Paul Fry at SST Publications, by the way, did a magnificent job with those editions. He gave me my shot, kind of as a first novel, and I mean he did such a beautiful job with these books, with the hardcovers and the paperbacks, and I mean to actually get one of them and hold them in your hands, I mean, for me, it's like just one of the biggest thrills. And his attention to detail with putting them all together was so great. I also do need to, if I can give a shout out, I'd love to give a shout out to my cover artist, John Gallagher. I mean, John's covers for these books, which with these kind of wraparound cinematic covers, he's a good friend of mine, and he's actually largely a film illustrator and film designer. But just the way the detail in which he kind of rendered those images. I mean, he's actually been around since the book started both these books started as a 10,000 word short story, and he did concept art for that before they even became a first novel. Before the first book became a first novel, and John did graphics for that. And for me, his graphics, cover art are an essential part of the identity of the series. I mean, it's one of the most fun parts of the whole process.
It's I have to say, these are just vicious looking. And again, I apologize, the sun has suddenly come out. I don't know if people can see it, but that is just one mean looking werewolf on the front covers. So
She-wolf.
She-wolf. Shh. Didn't want to give away the plot. I hate spoilers.
It's on the back. It's on the back of the book.
Yeah, that's true. That's very, very true. It's very interesting. So we've got the two books. As I say, there is a definite cliffhanger at the end of the second book, which is going to lead us into the third book. When's the third book coming out?
Next year.
Next year. Cool.
Yeah.
Have you written it?
I've mapped it out. I mean, this story cycle ends there. It's the final, it's the ultimate reckoning and final showdown of the werewolf and gunfighter factions. I mean, I'm not really giving a major spoiler away to say the third book is a family story. It's actually about two different families. It's about a family of people who are not consanguinated by blood, but who are family through friendship and through shared ordeal and camaraderie, and a family of werewolves who are whose every effort to try to define themselves as a family is undermined by their own completely destructive werewolf nature. So there's a certain amount of dark humor in the third one. I think it's going to be in the third one. Without going into a lot of detail, but they're a dysfunctional family, but yet it's really about two families. And sort of which winds up, and because I believe that family has nothing to do with blood. I feel it has to do with whether you call it soulmates or spiritual kinship. I mean, I think I don't even believe in consanguination. So the book comes out on the side of course the heroes who have all met each other over one part of the other of the journey, but are every bit of family.
Yeah, that was interesting. Now you say you've mapped this out, and that was something I meant to touch on earlier on. That what writing app do you write in longhand? Do you write it on a laptop, or what's your kind of? You said you do 2,000 words a day. What's your methodology?
I write on a laptop. I work on Word, and usually before I write a book, I mean months before, I start making notes. I'll first write, if I think an idea is good, I'll write it into a paragraph, and that log line, that tagline, whatever you want to call it, that's sort of the first step. And then I'll write a one-page on it. This is a habit I bring over from screenwriting, and break out a beginning, middle, and end. And then usually after that, before I start writing a book, I think about it for months and months and months, and I'm constantly getting ideas. You get ideas walking down the street, going to the market, talking to your wife, walking the dogs. I mean, you're always getting, but certain ones, the ideas just keep coming. And at a certain point, it builds up the cabin pressure and you're ready to write, that's sort of how it works. But if I try to figure out a beginning, middle, and end, sometimes that changes. And then finally I sit down and I start writing it. And then the page count varies a bit, but I try to keep on a certain schedule, just because I find that momentum is a good thing. You get out of your head and you let the story begin to write itself. And then I do it in two passes. I'll do a first pass, which is that, and I don't edit myself. I'll sit down and I let the story come. And then I do the second pass, which takes just as long, of going back and revising it and reworking it and adding new things and polishing it. And then there's the last terrible, horrific, nightmarish Chinese water torture of actually proofing the damn thing. And after you've read it 100 times, going through and looking at every one of those 80,000 words, that I don't know how people do it. It's the part I dread. I dread it like, belladonna.
I remember, I really do remember Clive Barker saying exactly the same. He said, it is the punishment for all the joys of writing. It is. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Barker's absolutely right. It is. Yeah. He was getting through galley proofs in those days of it's like, this is the punishment for all that joy that went into it to begin with, and the fun of creating all this stuff.
But you have to do it. You have to do it. There's an element of iteration and tedious discipline that's involved in writing a book. It's really boring to read that book for the 100th time, but the 10th time you go through it, the 11th time, you find a mistake that the proofers missed, an error, a misspelling, no matter how many eyeballs look at it. And so you do actually have to go through this process until it's done. But yeah, there's a fun part, and then there's the other part, which is the proofing is I don't know, it's the worst part. It's so boring. Brings up my latent OCD.
Yeah, very useful thing to have in the in those sort of terms. Okay, well, we're actually coming to the end of our hour together. So we talked about the wolf, the three werewolf books. What else have you got coming out at the moment?
My next novel, my next two novels actually, are a straight period Western series that I'm writing for a major publisher. That's our classic Westerns. I mean, I don't know if the books are classic, but they're straight Westerns.
Right.
You know, they're about a tough gunfighter in Wyoming, which is a place I know very well. And it's the book series is called the Joe Noose Westerns, and the first book is called Noose, and the second one is called Hanging Fire. And they're very, very action-packed, violent, linear, not unlike, you know, some of the movies I used to make in the 80s. They're good guy, bad guy stories. There's no, I mean, even the Wolves of El Diablo has a certain amount of ambiguity where you like the bad guy, the villainous a little bit, and the good guys have some edge to them.
Yeah.
There's very little. The bad guy is straight bad and Noose, and the good guy is you root for him every step of the way. So, but they're I should say they're classical Westerns, and hopefully it's going to be I hope to write 10 or 15 of these if people enjoy them. It's going to follow this character over different adventures.
Oh, those sound very cool. Those sound very, very cool.
But I'm probably not going to write a Western for a while.
just like kids' books or something. Yeah, just something very, very different.
That'd be fun. Or mythology like Lord of the Rings or Narnia. I mean, it would be fun to write a book that kids could read, that you could read to your kids. A mythology that has all that sense of adventure, but it's still that's probably up the road somewhere.
Right. Excellent. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining me, Eric.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
That's been my pleasure. I just want to remind folks that next week I'm going to be chatting with Zach Thompson and Lonnie Nadler about the comic Dread and their other comic works, and that'll be in the 99th show. And then the 100th episode, that's going to be a tribute to George Romero. I'll put out some more details about that sometime during the week. Eric, thank you very much indeed for joining me, and cheerio, folks, and hopefully see some of you next week.
Thank you, Nick. Bye, everybody.
Cheers. Bye.